Have you ever noticed how some people seem completely immune to what everyone else is doing, wearing, or believing, while others shift with every new wave that comes along? What makes someone watch the world move in one direction and consciously choose to stand still or walk another path entirely? This isn't about rebellion or superiority. It's about something far more interesting happening inside the human mind. Something that reveals how we construct identity, how we process information, and how we decide what actually matters to us, versus what we're told should matter. There's a specific psychological profile that emerges when researchers study people who consistently resist following trends. And understanding it might change how you see both yourself and the people around it. These individuals aren't necessarily contrarians or outsiders by nature. They're operating from a different decision-making framework entirely, one that prioritizes internal validation over external approval, and the mechanics of how this works touch on everything from childhood attachment styles to how our brains process novelty and threat. When everyone around you is buying the same product, adopting the same opinion, or sharing the same outrage, there's an enormous psychological pressure at play, something called informational social influence, where we assume that if many people are doing something, they must know something we don't. But people who don't follow trends seem to have developed a buffer against this assumption. They've learned, either through temperament or experience, to question whether popularity equals validity. This often begins in childhood, where some children naturally develop what psychologists call an internal locus of control, meaning they believe their outcomes are determined by their own actions rather than external forces, and this creates a foundation for independent thinking that persists into adulthood. These people don't wake up trying to be different, they simply have a cognitive habit of asking, does this actually serve me, before adopting any behavior or belief, and that single question acts as a filter that most people never consciously apply. When a new social media platform explodes in popularity, when a fashion trend dominates every store, when a political narrative sweeps through communities, the majority of people feel an almost gravitational pull toward participation because our brains are wired for belonging. We evolved in small tribes where exclusion could mean death. So conformity became a survival mechanism embedded deep in our neural architecture. People who resist trends aren't free from this wiring, they're just navigating it differently, often because they've experienced situations where following the crowd led to negative outcomes, or because they developed strong personal values early on that serve as an anchor when social winds shift. There's also a cognitive trait called need for uniqueness, which isn't about being special for its own sake, but about maintaining a distinct sense of self that doesn't dissolve into group identity. And research shows this trait correlates with higher tolerance for uncertainty and lower anxiety about social judgment. When you watch someone scroll past the viral challenge everyone's doing, or ignore the product everyone's buying, or remain quiet during a conversation where everyone shares the same opinion, what you're witnessing isn't necessarily confidence or stubbornness, it's often a calculated pause, a moment where their brain is running a different algorithm that weighs long-term identity coherence against short-term social comfort. This is why you'll find these individuals across all intelligence levels and backgrounds. It's not about being smarter, it's about having developed or inherited a psychological immune system against collective momentum. Consider how marketing works. Advertisers don't sell products, they sell the fear of being left behind, the promise of belonging, the shortcut to an identity that's already been validated by others. And this works on almost everyone to varying degrees because it's targeting evolutionary vulnerabilities. The person who doesn't follow trends has somehow developed antibodies against these tactics, not because they're immune to desire or belonging, but because they've trained themselves, consciously or not, to separate their sense of self from their consumption patterns and social performances. You see this play out in subtle ways every day. Someone continues reading physical books when everyone celebrates digital. Someone maintains privacy when oversharing becomes the norm. Someone holds a political position that doesn't fit neatly into current tribal divisions, and the psychological cost of these choices is real. These people often experience more social friction, more moments of isolation, more instances where they have to explain themselves or simply accept being misunderstood. This is important to recognize because it's easy to romanticize independence. But there's genuine discomfort in repeatedly choosing the path that separates you from immediate social rewards. And people who do this aren't superhuman. They've simply decided, often unconsciously, that the discomfort of non-conformity is preferable to the discomfort of self-betrayal. Intelligence doesn't protect anyone from trend-following behavior. In fact, Highly intelligent people can be more susceptible in certain contexts because they're skilled at rationalizing decisions after the fact. They can construct, elaborate justifications for why they're adopting a trend, making it feel like a reasoned choice when it's actually social pressure dressed in intellectual clothing. The human need for belonging doesn't decrease with education or IQ. It just becomes more sophisticated in how it manifests. So a brilliant academic might follow intellectual trends within their field with the same unconscious conformity that someone else follows fashion trends. The mechanism is identical, only the domain changes. What distinguishes trend-resistant people isn't raw intelligence, but metacognition, the ability to observe their own thinking processes, to catch themselves in the moment of being influenced and to examine whether that influence aligns with their deeper values and goals. This is a skill that can be developed. It starts with simply noticing the gap between your automatic reactions and your conceded responses. Noticing when you feel compelled to have an opinion on something everyone's discussing, or when you feel pressure to participate in something primarily because of its popularity rather than its intrinsic value to you. The most interesting aspect of this psychology is that these people aren't necessarily happier or more successful in conventional terms. They've simply optimized for a different outcome. They've prioritized internal coherence over external validation, and that trade-off comes with both benefits and costs that vary across different life contexts. When you become aware of how trends operate, how they create artificial urgency, how they leverage your fear of missing out and your desire for tribal belonging, you don't become immune to influence, but you do create space between stimulus and response. You gain the ability to choose which influences you allow to shape you and which ones you consciously decline. This isn't about becoming cynical or isolated. It's about recognizing that your attention and your choices are valuable, and that you have more agency than the constant pressure of trending content and viral movements would suggest. The person who doesn't follow trends has learned something fundamental about human nature. That just because something is popular doesn't mean it's important. That just because everyone is moving in one direction doesn't mean that direction leads somewhere worth going. And that sometimes the most meaningful path is the one you have to clear yourself. Even when you can see the well-worn highway, everyone else is traveling right beside you. The question isn't whether you should follow trends or reject them. That's too simplistic. The question is whether you're making conscious choices based on your actual values and needs, or whether you're outsourcing those decisions to whatever happens to have momentum in your particular social sphere at any given moment. When you pause and observe the next trend that sweeps through your awareness, notice what you feel, notice the pull, notice the fear of being left out. Notice the desire to have something to talk about. Notice the assumption that popularity might equal value, and in that noticing, you might discover something about how your own mind works. Something about the difference between who you are and who you're being told to be. Something about the quiet, unglamorous courage it takes to simply remain yourself when the world is constantly offering you new costumes to wear and new scripts to perform.